Hello, my name is David Malin, and I teach a course called CS50 at Harvard, our introductory course in computer science for majors and non-majors, a one-semester amalgam of courses generally known elsewhere as CS1 and CS2. If you'd like to follow along with these slides, they can be found at this URL here. Now, this is an initiative born of a particularly personal experience of my own. Back in 1996, I was a sophomore in college trying to muster the courage to take precisely this class, CS50. At the time, I was majoring in something else, but I was curious about the field, but rather feared this threshold, didn't know if it would be a field for me. And in some sense, I feared failure, not wanting to do not as well in this particular course or this field than I felt I was already doing elsewhere. But what finally got me over that threshold was because the professor at the time wonderfully agreed to sign a pass-fail form so that I could take the course not for a letter grade, but indeed pass-fail, the bar for which was at D- or higher for pass, otherwise a fail. But at the time, the mechanism for opting in to pass-fail in this way was literally a pink form that all too often students like myself would bring down to the front of the class in front of all of their classmates at the end of the first week and ask for the professor's signature. I worried all too often at the time and ever since that this was all too much of an admission of not necessarily being able to cut it in a field and not really the right mechanism for trying to explore unfamiliar waters. And indeed, had I not been able to cross that threshold and take this course pass-fail, I certainly wouldn't have found my own path in life, because 2007, some years later, did I find myself ultimately at the helm of this same class, CS50, teaching it ever since. And among my goals in taking on the class were to focus all the more on accessibility, particularly to those students who had little or no prior background, so that students like me and like some of my classmates wouldn't hesitate nearly as much and would certainly be willing, ultimately, to cross that threshold, not shying away simply for fear of failure in some form. Now, once I got my footing with teaching the course itself a few years later in 2010, did I decide to tackle precisely this, not only embracing pass-fail and those forms, but doing away, ultimately, with letter grades themselves. We discussed, indeed, within a department, explaining the motivation therefore, and ultimately proposed that we implement what the university here calls satisfactory, unsatisfactory grading, otherwise known as SAT-UNSAT. Similar in spirit to pass-fail, but with two key distinctions. The threshold for a satisfactory grade, or SAT, is C- or higher, which felt a more reasonable threshold for evaluating the quality of a student's work and their experience than something as low as a D-. And also, even more compellingly, it's entirely self-service. No form or signature would be required for SAT-UNSAT. Now, the motivation ultimately was to empower students to explore waters unfamiliar to them without fear of failure, whether failure is literally a fail or even something lower than a grade than they might like. And indeed, we felt at the time, and I felt in particular at the time, that a student who takes a course SAT-UNSAT but does not and decides to concentrate it ultimately is a successful outcome. If the reason a student ultimately is taking a class and then finding their way, that is itself a successful outcome, even if they didn't necessarily know a priori that it was a field for them. And now, more philosophically, I dare say that feedback is certainly good. And so the goal was not to lower a bar to students' experience in the class or the evaluation of their work, but feedback is good, but relative feedback week to week is good in terms of improving and reinforcing students' learning. But this tradition that we have of constant evaluation with students so focused on grade is surely not what education should be. So underlying this SAT-UNSAT initiative was trying to chip away at what had all too long been students' focus on grades, my own as well, in hopes of empowering them to explore unfamiliar waters, particularly in an introductory course or dare say a gateway course like ours or other fields that have similar introductions. And so this initiative, proposing that we eliminate letter grades altogether in CS50 in favor instead of SAT-UNSAT, attracted a bit of attention. Pictured here, for instance, is the headline that appeared some days later in the university student newspaper. Unfortunately, a few days later, did subsequent headlines appear, the result of quite a few additional conversations that then began to happen behind the scenes. Indeed, even though we had discussed this as a department, it turned out that there were all too many ramifications or ripple effects of changing CS50's own scheme, insofar as CS50 is quite often taken by students not only in CS or in other majors, but other majors that require it for their own major or concentration credit. And so ultimately, not that many days later did unfortunately this headline debut, which indeed confirmed that in 2010 at least, this initiative, this vision, was not to be. Now, among the challenges we encountered along the way with this vision for using SAT-UNSAT only in lieu of letter grades entirely were quite simply that some of the concentrations or majors on campus, particularly in fields related to CS, were just unwilling to accept SAT for concentration or major credit. There was this worry that SAT-UNSAT itself would impact learning outcomes for students. And indeed, there was this presumption that students taking a class, SAT-UNSAT, or even back in the day, pass-fail, would necessarily spend less time or learn less in the course. Now, to be fair, we ourselves, and I myself, as this course's instructor, did worry that if students were taking CS50 SAT-UNSAT in the context of taking 3 or more other traditionally letter-graded classes, then they might very well rationally prioritize those other classes, spending only as much time on the course as they might need to in order to achieve that threshold for SAT. And so to be fair, that was indeed an open question, but for us was an experimental question to consider then in the months and semesters to come. There were other concerns too, that it might affect us if a student were to take a course for not a letter grade, that Albeit accreditation, the Accreditation Board for Engineering and Technology, might be impacted. But ultimately, did we confirm that letter grades are not a prerequisite for that form of accreditation. But ultimately, it was the case that the program in general education at Harvard did require across the board letter grades for any courses taken for credit. And insofar as our course did satisfy one form of general education, that might very well be a barrier to students taking CS50 SAT-UNSAT if indeed it was the only option. They might not be able to take the course at all. But it turns out, as a side effect of merely this conversation happening on campus and the visibility, as per those headlines, is that whereas in 2009, when only 2% at that point of the class were enrolling pass-fail via those pink forms signature required, in 2010, coincident with this proposal of ours to transition to SAT-UNSAT, did 10% of the students that fall later end up enrolling pass-fail via those same forms. And so we presumed at the time that it was merely the visibility of the visibility of the conversation on campus that actually raised awareness that not only was pass-fail available to students, but indeed it was very much encouraged. Well beyond my own words in lecture, but now across campus itself. Now, a few years later in 2013, did we muster a little bit more energy to take another stab at this problem, having had a few years and a number of semesters not only to collect data on this pass-fail students, but also to have all the more conversations across departments on campus and within general education as well. And so this time, too, we proposed more of a compromise, not to eliminate letter grades altogether in CS50, but instead to add SAT-UNSAT as an option alongside existing letter grades. And so what ultimately appeared in the university's SIS that year was an option similar in spirit to this, where students could self-select when registering for classes whether they'd like to opt into the letter-graded version of CS50 or the SAT-UNSAT version of CS50. So gone at least were those pink forms and the stigma we presumed existed. To be clear, though, for SAT, we set certain expectations that the students opting for this form could not simply do only some percentage of the course's work. There were still requirements that needed to be met, and indeed in the course's syllabus and throughout the semester did we emphasize that these students taking the course on SAT-UNSAT or for a letter grade were beholden to this language here. Whether taking the course SAT-UNSAT or for a letter grade, you must ordinarily submit 9 problem sets, take 1 test and 1 quiz, and submit a final project in order to be eligible for a satisfactory grade unless granted an exception in writing by the course's heads. And so indeed, that threshold in particular was key, we felt, to ensuring that students would not only meet just that threshold of C- or higher for SAT, but indeed would hit a much higher mark, but nonetheless be able to cross that threshold more readily than I myself would otherwise have done. Meanwhile, it's worth noting, too, that the students taking the course that year, SAT-UNSAT, would still receive just as much feedback, including scores on every assessment, via which to form their own opinion by term's end whether or not CS onward was a field for them, since that, too, was a concern in some circles that students wouldn't necessarily receive as much feedback or much reinforcement, positive or negative, as to whether or not they should perhaps even major in the field. But there, too, did we make clear that during the semester, students would be treated no differently, but they needn't worry as much about what mark appears on their transcript at term's end if taking it instead SAT-UNSAT. Now here too there were challenges with offering SAT-UNSAT as an option alongside of letter grades. Frankly, how to implement it in the SIS was perhaps the most challenging issue from the get-go. Wonderfully, we garnered the support of the university's registrar who worked with us to forge a solution, and per that screenshot earlier, the mechanics of it ended up being students registering for either one version of the course or another, which were literally 2 separate courses in the system with their own unique identifiers, their own gradebooks, and the like. So it did add for us, the course, a bit of an administrative overhead, essentially running one course as 2, but the reality was that got the job done and allowed students to self-select at term start without needing to approach for a signature. It was still the case with this option in place that letter grades were required by some concentrations on campus. That concern remained, but less concerning for those departments at least was that SAT would impact learning outcomes insofar as those students who were considering majoring in those other fields that required letter grades could still register for CS50 via the letter graded option. And accreditation was no longer an issue as per our vetting years prior, but there was now a new concern given that students had this fork in the road at term start via which to choose SAT, UNSAT, or letter grade, that they might register for the wrong option, simply mechanically, or that they might decide after the fact, after taking CS50 to concentrate in some field that it turns out requires letter grades for all of their concentration classes, CS50 perhaps among them. Now, we pushed back on that one, noting that if a student takes a course like CS50 because it is available to them SAT, UNSAT, thereby allowing them to explore an unfamiliar field that they might not have even considered once before available to them as a major, and then decides on it as a major, that in itself is surely a successful outcome and far superior to the student not even exploring those waters from the get-go. But nonetheless, those were among the concerns latent with the SAT, UNSAT option. And of course remained the issue that letter grades were still required for the program in general education. Now, it turns out that this transition from offering only pass-fail as an option to now offering only SAT, UNSAT alongside letter grades as an option in lieu of pass-fail, that it didn't really have any effect, at least numerically, on the percentages of students taking the course, previously pass-fail, and now SAT, UNSAT. In fact, in 2010, whereas we had some 10% of students still taking the course pass-fail, in 2013, taking SAT, UNSAT were just 12% of the course's students. And beyond that, it was roughly the same with some ups and downs over the years thereafter. So there was no statistical impact, it really seemed, on our numbers. And so the stigma of those pink forms, frankly, were not perhaps the stigma we once thought that they were. But we did still feel we could do better because certainly within campus and among students shopping the course that is considering, was there still this fear factor remaining. And so in 2017, just a few years later, did we propose to now make SAT, UNSAT the default, still alongside a letter graded option, but to signal all the more strongly to students that SAT, UNSAT is not only an option, but it is encouraged and, dare say, expected unless you have circumstances such as a concentration for which a letter grade is actually required. And so in this model, what we did was, with the registrar's support, enroll all students in CS50, SAT, UNSAT at term start, and then by the term's fifth Monday, the traditional deadline at the university for making any changes to courses, students could decide to opt out of SAT, UNSAT and into a letter grade, not only if they had to meet some letter graded requirement, for instance, for their concentration, but also more thoughtfully after they had 5 weeks or so of experience and feedback under their belt to decide if this is indeed something for them and they want to dive in all the more and focus on the letter grades they might receive, or continue to explore, still not quite sure if this is a field for them. Here, too, did we discuss with departments across campus, not only within our own, but there still here were some challenges with making SAT, UNSAT the default, alongside still the availability of letter grades if students opted out of the former and into the latter. How best to implement this was a challenge, but that one, too, was solved. But letter grades were still required for some concentrations, and there still was the concern that students might register for the wrong option, or that they might decide on their concentration after taking CS50 SAT, UNSAT, the implication of which was that now they would be one course short of a letter grade to meet that concentration's expectations. There, too, we emphasize that that should be considered a successful outcome, but even so, we reassured that through a gauntlet of prompts and reminders and emails on campus within those first 5 weeks, would we remind students constantly not only of the opportunity to opt out of SAT, UNSAT into letter grade, but that they need, in fact, do it for a prescribed list of concentrations that we provided to them. But coincident with this initiative now in 2017 was a change in the requirements for general education, such that this one was no longer a concern because students could now take, as of 2017, CS50, SAT, UNSAT, and also receive credit from the program in general education. And indeed, this was impactful, this change. This flipping of the bit from an option to a default resulted in, from 2013 with 12% of students taking the course SAT, UNSAT, to some 31% of students taking the course in 2017 SAT, UNSAT, up from 9% in 2016. The year prior. And since then have those numbers remain, even rising a bit in more recent years, with all the more students electing and staying with SAT, UNSAT. And now, to be sure, some of that is surely that students are simply sticking with the default in and of itself. and as opposed to taking the effort to opt out, even though the mechanism for opting out is simply filling out one form. But there too, the messaging that we've had and the emphasis we've now placed that this is not only available but encouraged, we do think has sunk in all the more among students. And indeed, among those students still opting for letter grades, have there been really some extrinsic factors. Indeed, when we ask students in 2017 to provide us with reasons for why they elected SAT, UNSAT, or a letter grade, among students who took the course SAT, UNSAT in 2017, some 600 plus students, these here were the reasons. Students were not sure they would do well, so they didn't want to risk a letter grade. They had a high workload this semester in other courses or commitments. They're taking CS50 as an elective and don't need a letter grade. They're taking it for concentration credit but don't need a letter grade. They're advised by their advisor to take it SAT, UNSAT, or they're taking it for Gen Ed credit and don't need a letter grade. But the two most common reasons there were indeed these. The reasons being because their concentration required a letter grade. Now, among those students who we asked the same question, why did you take the course for a letter grade, the reasons were similar, and focusing here on two of the topmost results were that they were required by their declared or intended concentration to take it for a letter grade, and they were required by one or more concentrations that they're considering to take it for a letter grade. So indeed, it really was the mechanics of the requirements of these external factors driving still that choice, even with the numbers as much higher as they were. But when we considered for the sake of making a stronger case to those departments that indeed SAT, UNSAT should not only be an option but encouraged, particularly in these introductory and gateway courses, we took a look in 2017 at the amount of time students were reporting spending week to week on the course's problem sets or programming assignments. Pictured here on the x-axis is our problem set or assignment from 0 through 8. Pictured here on the y-axis is the time spent in hours on each of those problem sets. Among SAT, UNSAT students, depicted here with the blue line, and letter graded students, depicted here with the red dashed line. And indeed, we see here from this chart that our SAT, UNSAT students, our 31% of students, were actually spending as much or more time typically on each of the course's problem sets, certainly by no means coasting. And when we ask these same students week to week to self-report their stress levels on a scale of 0 to 10 here on the x-axis, on the y-axis, and then here on the x-axis the particular week, we saw here too that in blue, the SAT, UNSAT students reported as much or more stress than their letter graded classmates, thereby suggesting to us again that these students taking the course on SAT were certainly not just scraping by or coasting. They were indeed as invested in and in meeting those expectations as were, it would seem, their letter graded classmates. And when we consider the learning outcomes, at least quantitatively in terms of letter grades, we see this. Pictured here are the course's problem sets, test, quiz, and final project along the x-axis from left to right. And pictured on the y-axis here is the score that they might receive out of 100% averaged over all of those assessments. In blue, again, are the SAT, UNSAT students, and in red here are the letter graded students. And in this case, do you see that students are that the difference in performance on the course's problem sets was just 4 percentage points between the two demographics. On the test and the quiz, it was larger with 9 percentage points each, but on the course's final project or capstone on which we end the semester was the performance equivalent. But it's worth noting that when you consider the backgrounds of the students taking the course SAT, UNSAT, students taking the course SAT, UNSAT here in green, 80% of them had never taken a prior CS course before, whereas only 62% of their letter graded classmates reported the same. Meanwhile, 17% of SAT, UNSAT students had taken one course prior, whereas 24% of students taking it for a letter grade had taken the same. And then lastly, only 3% of the students taking it SAT, UNSAT had taken 2 or more prior CS courses, but 14% of the students taking it for a letter grade had taken 2 or more courses too. So when we actually look back at these values in 2017 and at these deltas, but rewind 1 year prior to 2016 when it wasn't 31% of the class taking the course SAT, UNSAT, but a much smaller percentage, 9% instead, these deltas were much more significant. Indeed, in 2017, these again were the deltas. For instance, 4 percentage points of difference on the problem sets and 0 percentage points of difference on the final project. And in 2016, were these the corresponding deltas? 13 percentage points of difference on the course's problem sets and 9 percentage points of difference on the course's final project. Indeed, as the number of students taking the course SAT, UNSAT grew between 2016 and 2017, and that demographic became more representative of the class as a whole, those deltas narrowed. Students' performance was nearly the same on the course's problem sets and indeed the same on the course's final project. Now, what remains then for 2021 and beyond? Well, we ultimately reject the presumption that taking a course SAT, UNSAT, or perhaps even pass-fail, that those students will not work as hard or learn as much as their letter-graded classmates, provided, however, that the same expectations are set for all students. We aspire in the semesters and the years to come to do all the more outreach to departments to see if we can't chip away at some of those extrinsic requirements that are driving students to select letter grades instead of SAT, UNSAT. And then ultimately, do I hope, for SAT, UNSAT to become longer term CS50's only grades. Please do feel free to reach out with any questions.